I still remember the exact sound my coffee mug made when it hit the kitchen floor. That sharp, ceramic crack echoed through my whole house like a gunshot, and I didn't even flinch. I was too busy staring out my kitchen window at the empty space where my gate used to be. Not broken, not hanging off its hinges, gone. Completely, deliberately, surgically removed, like it had never existed in the first place. Like the 4 years I'd spent saving up for that wrought iron custom gate meant absolutely nothing to anyone but me. It was 6:47 in the morning, a Tuesday. I remember because I had a work call at 8 a.m. and I'd woken up early specifically to water my front garden before the Alabama heat turned brutal. I'd put on my robe, poured my coffee, and padded toward the window with that half-awake kind of peace you only get in those quiet morning minutes before the world starts demanding things from you. And then I looked outside, and my world cracked right down the middle. My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm 38 years old. I'm a licensed contractor, a single mother of one teenage daughter named Bree, and I own the corner house on Callaway Street in a mid-sized suburb outside of Birmingham, Alabama. I worked hard for that house, harder than most people will ever understand. I grew up with nothing, and I mean nothing in the truest, most bone-deep sense of that word. My mama rented her whole life. My grandmama rented her whole life. I was supposed to rent my whole life too, according to every circumstance I was born into. But I didn't. I scraped, I sacrificed, I took every overtime job and weekend gig I could find, and at 34 years old, I signed my name on a mortgage and became the first woman in 3 generations of Whitfield women to own something, to have ground beneath her feet that was legally, permanently, undeniably hers. That gate was more than iron and welding and money. That gate was a symbol. It said, "This is mine. I built this. You don't come in unless I say so." And someone had ripped it right off its foundation. I set down what was left of my coffee, already on the counter by then, though I don't remember putting it there, and walked to my front door. I stepped outside in the early morning air, still in my robe and slippers, and I stood on my porch and stared at the damage. The bolts had been unscrewed, not broken. This wasn't vandalism in the heat of the moment. This was planned, calculated. Someone had brought tools. Someone had stood on my property in the dark of night and worked. My eyes drifted left, straight to the Hendersons' house. Their porch light was off. Their curtains were still. But something told me, deep in my gut, that somebody over there was wide awake and watching. If you've ever come outside to find something you loved just gone, stolen or destroyed by someone who thought you wouldn't fight back, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because honey, I fought back, and this is just the beginning.
I didn't call the police that morning. I know that's the first thing everyone says I should have done, and trust me, I've replayed that decision 1,000 times since. But here's what you need to understand about living on Callaway Street, and about the Hendersons specifically before you judge me for it. The Henderson family had lived next door to me for 3 of my 4 years on this street. Rick and Pamela Henderson, mid-50s, both of them. Rick was a retired city engineer, and Pamela was one of those women who made homemaking look like a competitive sport. Perfect lawn, perfect shutters, perfect holiday decorations that went up exactly 30 days before every single holiday and came down exactly 2 days after. They were the kind of neighbors who smiled at your face and measured your grass height behind your back. I knew something was off about them within the first month of moving in. It started small. A note in my mailbox, typed, not handwritten, which told me everything, informing me that my recycling bins were aesthetically inconsistent with the block's visual standards. I didn't even know that was something a person could feel strongly about. Then came the complaint to the city about my porch railing needing repainting. Then the HOA grievance about my daughter's basketball hoop being 3 inches too close to the sidewalk. 3 inches! I measured it myself.
But here's the thing about Rick Henderson that you need to burn into your memory right now, because it becomes very important later. Rick Henderson used to work for the city, past tense, but his friendships with city inspectors, zoning officials, and permit officers, those were very much present tense. The man had connections the way spider webs have threads, everywhere, invisible until you walked right into them. And I had walked right into them more than once. Last spring, I applied for a permit to build a small workshop in my backyard. Denied, citing a zoning technicality that my contractor friends told me was borderline fabricated. 6 months before that, I'd tried to get approval to expand my driveway by 4 feet. Also denied. Both times, I had no proof. Both times, I had a very strong feeling. I stood at the edge of my property that Tuesday morning and looked at the clean, deliberate absence of my gate. The concrete anchor posts had been dug out. Dug out. That meant shovels. That meant time. That meant more than one person. I looked at the Henderson house again, and this time I noticed something I'd missed in my initial shock. There, just barely visible between their curtain and the window frame, was a sliver of light. Someone was standing at that window, watching me discover what they'd done, and they weren't even scared. That was the moment something shifted inside me, something old and quiet and iron-strong. Not rage, not yet, something colder than rage, something that felt a lot like strategy. I want to tell you about the smile, because it wasn't the missing gate that truly started this war. It wasn't the dug-out concrete posts or the deliberate precision of it all. It was the smile Pamela Henderson gave me at 7:15 that same morning when she walked out to collect her newspaper in her powder blue robe like it was any other Tuesday in the world. She looked right at me, and she smiled. Not the nervous smile of someone who knows they've done wrong and is overcompensating. Not the tight-lipped smile of someone trying to avoid confrontation. This was slow, satisfied, the kind of smile that says, I did this, I meant to do this, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. It was the smile of a woman who had already calculated every possible move I could make and decided in advance that none of them would work. I smiled back. I don't know where that came from. Every nerve in my body was fired up and screaming, but something in my brain clicked into a gear I didn't even know I had, and I smiled right back at Pamela Henderson, like we were two neighbors sharing a pleasant morning, like my gate wasn't missing, like my hands weren't shaking inside my robe when I stepped out to collect my own newspaper. She blinked, just once. Then she picked up her newspaper and went back inside. Good. Let her think she had me figured out. I went back inside too, and the first thing I did was call my contractor friend Marcus. Marcus Webb had been in the construction business in Jefferson County for over 20 years, and he knew more about local property law, building codes, and permit history than most lawyers I'd ever met. I'd known him since my own contracting days, and he was the kind of man who answered his phone at 7 a.m. without complaint. Marcus, I said when he picked up, I need you to pull every permit, every filing, every code violation report ever submitted on or about 114 C. Callaway Street. That was the Henderson property. And I need you to go back as far as the records allow. He was quiet for a second. Dana, what happened? My gate is gone. Another pause. Gone like stolen, or gone like someone brought tools and a plan and worked in the dark? I heard him exhale slowly. All right, give me until end of day. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment, looking at the window, at the empty space beyond it where my gate used to anchor my world. Bree was still asleep upstairs. She didn't know yet. I wasn't ready to explain it to her, not until I had something more than anger to show for it. Because anger without strategy is just noise, and I was done making noise. It was time to make moves. Marcus called me back at 4:47 that afternoon, and I knew from the tone of his first word that what he'd found was bigger than either of us expected. "Dana," he said, and there was something careful in his voice, like a man walking across ice he wasn't sure would hold. "You need to sit down for this one." I was already sitting. I'd spent most of the day oscillating between furious productivity and paralyzed disbelief. I'd filed a police report, which, as I expected, went nowhere fast. The officer who took my statement was polite, thorough, and absolutely clear through his professional neutrality that a missing gate on a property line was the kind of civil dispute that courts handled, not patrol units. He gave me a case number and a card, and the kind of sympathetic look that means, "Good luck with that." I'd also spent 2 hours photographing everything: the dugout post holes, the clean edges where the anchor bolts had been removed, the tire tracks in the soft dirt near my curb that suggested a truck had been used to haul the gate away. I documented everything with timestamps and uploaded every single image to a cloud folder I labeled simply Henderson. So when Marcus called, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a cold cup of coffee, and the focused energy of a woman who had already decided that whatever came next, she was going to be prepared for it. "Talk to me," I said. He took a breath. "Okay, so the Henderson property has a clean permit history on the surface. Everything filed, everything approved, all nice and tidy going back about 15 years. He paused. "But here's where it gets interesting. About 6 years ago, Rick Henderson filed for and received approval to extend his back patio. The approved plans showed the extension stopping 18 inches from the shared property line, your side. And?" I said. "And when I cross-referenced the approved plans with the county's current property survey maps, that patio extension, it's sitting approximately 14 inches over the property line, into your land, Dana. Has been for 6 years. The kitchen went very quiet. "Marcus," I said slowly, "how hard would it be to get a city inspector out to verify all of this?" He almost laughed. "With a licensed contractor with documented evidence and a formal complaint? Not hard at all." I looked out my window at the empty space where my gate used to be. "Then let's get started," I said. There's a particular kind of power in knowing something that the person who wronged you doesn't know you know. I sat with that power for 3 whole days. I let it settle into my bones like warmth. I went about my routine. Dropped Bree at school, went to work, watered my garden, waved at Pamela Henderson across the fence line like everything was perfectly fine. And every single time she waved back with that slow, satisfied smile of hers, I felt the information Marcus had given me burning quietly in my chest like a coal that never goes out. She thought she'd won round 1. She had absolutely no idea there wasn't going to be a round 2. During those 3 days, I did 3 very specific things that I need you to understand because they matter enormously to everything that comes after. First, I hired a licensed surveyor named Gerald Potts, recommended by Marcus, 22 years in Jefferson County, testified in court over 40 times, to come out and conduct a formal boundary survey of my property and the Henderson property. Gerald was a small, precise man with a gray mustache and an absolutely zero-tolerance relationship with inaccuracy. He spent 4 hours on a Thursday morning with his equipment and his assistant, and when he handed me his written report that afternoon, every number Marcus had given me was confirmed and then some. The Henderson patio encroachment was not 14 inches, it was 19. Second thing I did, I contacted an attorney. Not just any attorney. I called Renee O'Coffer, a property rights lawyer out of Birmingham who had a reputation for being equal parts brilliant and relentless. I'd heard her name twice in contractor circles, always in the context of cases where someone underestimated a property owner and lived to deeply regret it. I sent Renee the surveyor's report, Marcus's findings, my time-stamped photographs, and the police report from the gate incident. She called me back within 2 hours. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "you have a very solid foundation here." She paused. No pun intended. I liked her immediately. Third thing I did was talk to my neighbor on the other side of the Hendersons. Carmen Delgado had lived on Callaway Street for 11 years, long before the Hendersons arrived. She was a quiet woman, mid-60s, kept mostly to herself, but when I knocked on her door that Thursday evening and explained what Marcus had found about the retaining wall and her foundation drainage, the quiet fell right off her face. I've had water in my basement 3 times in the last 4 years. I spent $9,000 on waterproofing. She looked at me for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" she asked. And just like that, I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The storm was still quiet, but it was building, and the Hendersons were still smiling, completely unaware of the sky above their heads.
There is something deeply satisfying about watching a brilliant woman work. Renee Okafor called me on a Friday morning, exactly 1 week after my gate disappeared, and she walked me through her opening strategy with the calm, methodical precision of a surgeon explaining an operation she had performed 100 times before. I sat at my kitchen table with my legal pad and wrote down every word because I wanted to remember this moment later. I wanted to be able to look back at this exact conversation and trace the thread from here to the end. "We're going to start with a formal cease and desist," Renee said. "It will be addressed to Richard and Pamela Henderson, and it will document 3 things. 1, the unauthorized removal of your property, specifically the wrought iron gate and anchor infrastructure, valued at approximately $4,200, based on your original receipts. 2, the confirmed encroachment of their patio extension onto your land, as verified by licensed surveyor Gerald Potts. 3, formal notice that any further interference with your property will result in immediate litigation." "Will they take it seriously?" I asked. "People like the Hendersons take paper seriously," Renee said, "especially paper with my name on it." She wasn't being arrogant, she was being accurate. I'd done my research on Renee Okafor in those 3 quiet days, and what I found was a woman with a 31 case-winning streak in Jefferson County property disputes, and a reputation among local attorneys as someone you genuinely did not want on the other side of a filing. The cease and desist was delivered by certified mail on a Monday morning. I happened to be pulling out of my driveway at the exact moment the mail carrier approached the Henderson mailbox. I watched Rick Henderson open his front door in his weekend clothes, khakis and a polo, very predictable, and take the certified mail envelope with the kind of casual confidence of a man who had never once considered that a piece of mail could rearrange his entire life. He looked at the return address. I watched his face change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a movie moment of wide eyes and dropped jaws. It was subtler than that, and somehow worse. A slow tightening around his eyes, a stillness that replaced his usual easy morning manner. He looked up from the envelope and his gaze found me across the driveway. I gave him the smile this time. Slow, steady, satisfied. Then I got in my car and drove to work like it was any other Monday morning in the world. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your patience for weakness, you know exactly how that moment felt. Subscribe and keep watching, because Rick Henderson's reaction to that letter was only the opening note of a symphony that was about to get very, very loud. Carmen Delgado had also retained Renee by end of that same week. Now we were 2. Rick Henderson's first mistake was underestimating me. His second mistake was what he did 3 days after receiving Renee's cease and desist letter. I came home from work on a Wednesday evening to find a handwritten note tucked under my front door, not in my mailbox, under my door, which meant someone had walked up my porch steps and bent down and deliberately slid it across my threshold. That detail mattered. That was a message inside the message, a reminder that my space wasn't as protected as I thought. I picked it up with 2 fingers, already thinking about fingerprints, already thinking about documentation. The note was written on plain white paper in blue ink,
block letters, the kind of deliberate print someone uses when they want to disguise their natural handwriting, but don't quite know enough to understand that block printing has its own identifying characteristics. It said, "Drop it. You don't know who you're dealing with. This street was fine before you came. It can be fine again after you're gone." I read it twice. Then I photographed it in place before I'd even fully kicked it up. Then I placed it in a Ziploc bag. I'd started keeping a box of them in my entryway, which tells you something about my state of mind that week, and I texted Renee her photo within 60 seconds of reading it. Her response came back in under 3 minutes. "Perfect. Keep the original. This just became harassment and intimidation. Do not respond. Do not confront. Let them keep talking." So I didn't respond, I didn't confront. But I did do something that Rick Henderson absolutely did not anticipate. I went to my car, drove to the hardware store, and spent $412 on a complete exterior camera system. 4 cameras, wide angle, night vision, motion activated, cloud storage. I installed them myself that same evening because I am a licensed contractor, and installing cameras is approximately the easiest thing I know how to do. By 10 p.m. that Wednesday, every angle of my property, front, back, both sides, full view of the Henderson driveway and front porch, was covered, recorded, and uploading continuously to a private cloud account that only I and Renee had access to. I also installed one camera that captured a direct view of the Hendersons' front door and driveway, positioned carefully to ensure it was angled from entirely within my property line. Legal, documented, intentional. Then I went inside, made myself dinner, helped Bree with her history homework, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to look rattled. Rick Henderson had spent 3 days thinking that intimidation note would make me smaller. Instead, it had made me sharper, better equipped, and significantly more dangerous than I'd been before he slid it under my door. His third mistake was still coming, and it was going to be the one that cost him everything. I want to tell you what the camera caught on the very first night I installed it. I almost didn't check the footage the next morning. I was running late, Bree had misplaced her biology textbook, and we'd spent 20 minutes turning the house upside down looking for it, and by the time I got her out the door and into my car, I was already mentally 3 steps into my workday. But something pulled me back inside before I left. Some instinct, the same quiet iron instinct that had been guiding me through this whole thing, told me to sit down and open my laptop and check the overnight footage before I did anything else. I'm so glad I listened to it. The motion-activated timestamp read 2:14 a.m. The camera covering my north side yard, the side directly adjacent to the Henderson property, had triggered on a large moving shape. I leaned closer to my screen and watched. The night vision footage was crisp and green-tinted and absolutely unambiguous. A figure in dark clothing had come through the gap where my gate used to be, my gate that they had stolen, and walked deliberately along the side of my house to my backyard. I watched the figure crouch near my garden beds. I watched them stay crouched for approximately 4 minutes. I watched them stand, walk back the way they came, and disappear through the gap again. My hands were very steady as I saved the clip, copied it to 3 separate locations, and sent it to Renee before I even went outside to check the garden. When I did go outside, I found it immediately. Someone had poured what appeared to be a concentrated salt solution along a 6-foot section of my garden bed, the bed where I grew tomatoes and peppers, and the herbs I'd been cultivating for 2 years. The plants in that section were already showing stress, leaves beginning to curl at the edges in that particular way that means the roots are in crisis. I'd seen it once before on a job site where someone had contaminated soil by accident. There was no accident here. I photographed everything, collected a soil sample in a clean container for testing, measured the affected area, documented the entry path with photographs showing footprints in the soft dirt near the property line. Then I called Renee. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the shift in her voice when I told her what I'd found and what the camera had captured. That careful, measured attorney composure crackened just slightly at the edges, not with alarm, but with something that sounded almost like anticipation. "Dana," she said, "they just crossed from a civil matter into criminal territory. Trespassing, destruction of property. This is no longer just about a gate and a survey report." She paused. "This is now a criminal complaint with video evidence attached. Subscribe and stay with me, because everything is about to change."
Word travels fast on a small street. I didn't spread it myself. I want to be clear about that, because my attorney had specifically advised me to keep the details of our case private and off the neighborhood grapevine. Renee was precise about that. Don't discuss the evidence. Don't discuss the strategy. By Saturday afternoon, my doorbell rang 4 times. The first was old Mr. Patterson from 3 houses down, a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher who stood on my porch with his hands in his cardigan pockets and told me quietly that the Hendersons had reported his fence to the city twice in the last 3 years for code violations he still wasn't entirely sure were real. The second was Tanya Bridges, mid-40s, single mother like me, who lived directly across the street and told me that Pamela Henderson had submitted a formal HOA complaint about Tanya's teenage son washing their car in the driveway on a Sunday afternoon. The third visitor was a young couple, the Nguyen's, who'd moved in 8 months ago at the far end of the block, who had received 2 anonymous complaints to the HOA about their front yard landscaping within their first month of living there. They'd always suspected the Hendersons, but had no proof and no confidence that anyone would believe them. The fourth visitor was Carmen herself, who came over with a pan of homemade enchiladas and a folder. The folder contained photographs, dates, and written notes she'd been keeping for 2 years, documenting every incident she believed the Hendersons had orchestrated against her. Water damage dates, contractor invoices, a letter from her foundation specialist explicitly stating that the drainage pattern affecting her basement was consistent with externally redirected water flow. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by my neighbor's stories, and I felt something shift in the air of that room, something that had been small and personal, my gate, my garden, my property, was expanding into something much larger, a pattern, a history, a neighborhood held quiet by intimidation for years. I called Renee that evening after everyone had gone home. "How many complainants do we need for a pattern of harassment claim?" I asked her. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "In Jefferson County, 3 documented complainants with corroborating evidence creates a compelling pattern argument." Another pause. "How many do you have?" I looked at the notes spread across my kitchen table. Mr. Patterson, Tanya Bridges, the Nguyen's, Carmen Delgado, and me. I said, 5. Renee made a sound I hadn't heard from her before, low and quiet and deeply satisfied. "Dana," she said, "we're not filing a complaint anymore." "What are we filing?" I asked. "A coalition."
There is a moment in every fight when it stops being about you. I recognized that moment on a Sunday afternoon when 7 people sat around my dining room table. People who had lived alongside fear and frustration and quiet humiliation for years and looked at each other like they were seeing the street they lived on for the very first time. Mr. Patterson, Tanya Bridges, the Nguyen's, both of them, James and Lisa, Carmen Delgado, and a woman I hadn't expected, Sandra Moore, who lived at the very end of Callaway Street and had driven past my house 100 times without ever stopping until Carmen called her that morning. Sandra was soft-spoken and small, and she sat at the corner of my table with her hands folded and told us that 18 months ago the Hendersons had filed a complaint with Child Protective Services, anonymously, though Sandra had her suspicions, about her elderly mother who lived with her. The investigation had found absolutely nothing, naturally, because there was absolutely nothing to find. But Sandra had spent 3 months in the grinding anxiety of a CPS investigation while working full-time and caring for her mother and trying to keep her family together. The table went very quiet when she finished talking. Then Mr. Patterson reached across and put his hand over Sandra's folded ones and said, "You should have told us, sweetheart. You should have told us a long time ago." I had to look at my ceiling for a moment. Renee attended via speakerphone. She listened to every story without interrupting, and when everyone had finished, she laid out our options in plain, clear language that every single person at that table could follow. We had grounds for a multi-party civil suit alleging a sustained pattern of harassment, intimidation, and deliberate interference with neighbors' property rights and quality of life. We had Carmen's drainage and foundation damages. We had my gate, my garden, and the trespassing footage. We had documented HOA abuse across multiple households, and we had Sandra's CPS filing, which, while anonymous, was traceable through methods Renee described with a precision that told me she'd done exactly this before. "What does this cost us?" James Nguyen asked. "Practical. Reasonable." "My firm works on contingency for coalition cases of this nature," Renee said. "You pay nothing unless we win." Every person at that table signed a representation agreement before they went home that evening. I walked them each to my door and watched them cross the street and disappear into their houses, and I stood on my porch in the cooling evening air and looked at the Henderson house. Their lights were on. Their curtains were drawn. They had absolutely no idea what had just been assembled against them inside my dining room. The coalition of Callaway Street was real, and we were just getting started. I knew Rick Henderson would call in favors. I'd been expecting it. What I hadn't expected was how fast he'd move or how transparent he'd be about it. 4 days after Renee sent the Hendersons formal notice of the coalition complaint, I got a call from the city's building and zoning department. An inspector named Dale Pruitt, who I later confirmed had worked under Rick Henderson for 6 years before Rick's retirement, informed me that my property had been flagged for a routine inspection following an anonymous tip about potential code violations on my workshop foundation. My workshop foundation that had never been built because my permit had been denied 18 months ago. I let Inspector Pruitt talk. I let him explain the inspection process and the timeline and the potential violations in question. I took notes. I was polite and cooperative and completely calm. And when he finished, I said, "Mr. Pruitt, I'd be happy to accommodate any inspection. I'll also be notifying my attorney, Renee O'Coffer, of this call and its timing relative to our current legal proceedings. I'm sure you understand." The silence on his end lasted about 4 seconds longer than a comfortable silence should. "Of course," he said finally. "Standard procedure." "Of course," I agreed. I called Renee before I'd even put my phone down. She was not surprised, not even slightly. "This is called retaliatory interference," she told me, "and it is, in fact, illegal when it can be demonstrated to be connected to ongoing litigation, which this very much can be, given the timing and Inspector Pruitt's documented professional relationship with Richard Henderson." She added it to the filing. That was the thing about Rick Henderson's connections. Every time he used one against me, Renee turned it into another layer of our case. He was, essentially, building our argument for us, one favor at a time. Each call he made to a city contact, each anonymous tip he filed, each quiet word he put in the right ear, it all left a trail, and trails, in the hands of the right attorney, become roads that lead directly to accountability. Marcus had also quietly contacted 2 other city inspectors he trusted, men with no connection to Henderson, and they had independently confirmed the retaining wall violation and the patio encroachment. Their reports were now part of our official documentation. Meanwhile, the Hendersons had hired their own attorney. His name was Gary Tillman, and according to Renee, he was competent but conservative. He'll try to settle fast, she told me. He'll look at what we have and advise them to make this go away quietly. She paused. Don't let them make it go away quietly, Dana. I had absolutely no intention of doing that. This was never going to be quiet. Not after my gate, not after my garden, not after Sandra Moore's 3 months of CPS terror. Quiet was the one thing I was never going to give them. I did not expect Pamela Henderson to come to my door alone. It was a Thursday evening, just after 7, and I was in my kitchen helping Bree with a college application essay when the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and stood very still for a moment, processing what I was seeing. Then I opened the door. Pamela Henderson stood on my porch without her signature composure fully intact for the first time in the 4 years I'd known her. She was dressed neatly. Pamela was always dressed neatly, but there was something around her eyes that told me she hadn't been sleeping well. She was holding a small dish covered in aluminum foil that I recognized as a classic Southern peace offering, though in this context it felt almost absurd. "Dana," she said, "I was hoping we could talk." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I opened the door wider and stepped back. She came in and stood in my entryway and looked around my house with an expression I couldn't immediately read. I didn't invite her to sit. I stood with my arms loosely crossed and waited. "I want you to know that Rick acted without my knowledge on some of this. The gate, I didn't know he was going to go that far." "Some of this," I repeated, "but not all of it?" She had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Pamela, we've been on this street for a long time. We have a way things work here." "Your way," I said. "Things work your way here." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand you're angry." "Pamela," I said, keeping my voice very even, "I am past angry. Angry was week 1. What I am right now is organized." Something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe. Or the recognition of fear. "Gary, our attorney, he thinks that a mediated settlement would be in everyone's best interest," he said. "We're prepared to compensate you for the gate, for the garden damage. We can talk about the survey findings and work something out about the patio." "And Carmen Delgado's $9,000 in foundation repairs?" I said. "And Sandra Moore's 3 months of CPS investigation? And Mr. Patterson's city complaints? And the Nguyen's?" Her composure slipped another inch. "This is bigger than just you and me now, Pamela. You should know that before you come to anyone else's door with a dish and an offer." She looked down at the foil-covered dish in her hands like she'd forgotten she was holding it. "I'll show you out," I said quietly. She left without another word. I watched her cross back to her house and go inside. Then I closed my door, leaned against it for just a moment, and texted Renee 4 words. "She came to me." Renee's response came back immediately. "Do not settle. Not yet." The dish, whatever was in it, went straight in the trash. The independent city inspection happened on a Friday morning, and it was, without question, the single most satisfying professional event I had ever witnessed in my life. Renee had filed a formal request for an independent inspection of the Henderson property, separate from Dale Pruitt and his department, routed through the city's oversight office specifically to avoid any inspectors with Henderson connections. It had taken 11 days to arrange, and every one of those days I had woken up and reminded myself to be patient, to trust the process, to let the machinery work. The machinery worked beautifully. 2 inspectors arrived at 9 a.m. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand. Rick Henderson answered the door in his polo shirt and khakis, and I could see from across the driveway that he was performing his affable, retired city engineer routine. Handshakes, smiles, the easy confidence of a man who believed his connections had insulated him from consequence for so long that consequence had simply stopped feeling real. The inspection lasted 11 hours and 40 minutes. I know because I was on my porch for most of it, working on my laptop, absolutely not pretending to just happen to be outside. Carmen Delgado found a reason to water her front plants for about 40 minutes. Tanya Bridges walked her dog past the Henderson house 3 times. We were a neighborhood of women pretending not to watch something we were absolutely watching. Marcus had briefed me on what the inspectors would likely find. The patio encroachment, confirmed by Gerald Potts's survey, was the most straightforward violation. The retaining wall height exceeded permit specifications by nearly double, and Marcus had flagged one additional issue that I hadn't even known to look for. The Henderson garage conversion, completed 4 years ago, appeared to have been done without a proper electrical permit, which in Jefferson County created both a code violation and a homeowner's insurance complication of significant proportions. When the inspectors finally emerged from the backyard, their expressions were professionally neutral, in that specific way that means they found exactly what they were looking for. Rick Henderson stood on his porch watching them go to their vehicle and fill out their reports, and the easy confidence had drained completely from his posture. He stood very straight and very still. He looked for the first time like a man who understood that his insulation had failed. Renee called me that afternoon with the preliminary findings. Patio encroachment confirmed, retaining wall violation confirmed, unpermitted electrical work confirmed. The city would be issuing formal violation notices requiring remediation within 90 days. What does remediation mean for the patio? I asked, already knowing the answer, wanting to hear her say it. It means, Renee said, with that quiet satisfaction I'd come to recognize and love, that they will have to remove the encroaching section, which means demolishing part of their patio. I set down my coffee cup very carefully. How much of it? I asked. Based on the survey, she said, approximately 1/3. 1/3 of their perfect, permitted, carefully cultivated patio gone. Just like my gate. By the following Monday, all of Callaway Street knew about the inspection results. I still maintain that I did not personally spread this information. What I will acknowledge is that Carmen Delgado had absolutely no such restraint, and I cannot be held responsible for what Carmen Delgado does with information she becomes aware of through her own legal proceedings. That is between Carmen and her conscience, and Carmen's conscience appeared to be entirely at peace with it. The effect on the block was immediate and fascinating to watch. For years, Callaway Street had operated under a specific social architecture that I now understood clearly in retrospect. The Hendersons sat at the center of it, the established family, the connected family, the family whose approval carried weight with the HOA and the city offices and the unwritten social codes of the neighborhood. People had accommodated them, deferred to them, filed down their own edges to avoid friction with them. Not out of love or genuine respect, but out of the quiet, unspoken calculation that the cost of crossing them was higher than the cost of compliance. That calculation was changing in real time. Neighbors who had never waved at me more politely were stopping to talk. People I'd seen 100 times without ever learning their names were introducing themselves. There was a woman named Greta 4 houses down who I discovered had been fighting a drainage issue for 3 years that her contractor had privately told her was connected to altered grading on an adjacent property, and by adjacent he had meant the Henderson side of the block. There was a young man named Deshaun who'd moved in 2 years ago and spent 6 months trying to navigate the HOA process for a simple fence replacement before giving up entirely. He'd assumed the process was just bureaucratic. He was now reconsidering that assumption with some energy. The social architecture of Callaway Street was cracking along fault lines that had always been there, invisible under the smooth surface of enforced normalcy. Rick Henderson responded to all of this by doing the thing that powerful people do when they feel their power slipping. He became visible. He started appearing in his front yard more, talking to neighbors loudly about neighborhood pride and property values and the importance of community standards, performing confidence, performing authority. But people were watching differently now. The smile that used to land as assured came across as desperate. The authority that used to feel inevitable now felt like a costume. Pamela stopped coming outside much at all. I watched all of this from my porch and from my driveway and from behind my kitchen window, and I felt something that surprised me with its complexity. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was more like clarity, like watching a magic trick explained. The thing that had seemed powerful and mysterious revealed as entirely mechanical once you understood the mechanism. The mechanism was fear. It had always been fear. And fear, once named, loses most of its power.
Gary Tillman submitted a formal settlement offer on a Wednesday afternoon, and I read it at my kitchen table with Renee on speakerphone while Bree did homework upstairs, completely unaware that her mother was sitting downstairs making decisions that would define the next chapter of both their lives. The offer was structured in 4 parts. First, full replacement cost of my gate, $4,200, matching my original receipts exactly. Second, compensation for garden damage assessed at $800, which was frankly insulting given the 2 years of cultivation that salt solution had destroyed, but which I let pass without comment for the moment. Third, an agreement to remediate the patio encroachment within 60 days and restore the property line to its surveyed boundary. Fourth, a mutual non-disparagement clause, meaning neither party could speak publicly or privately about the dispute in negative terms going forward. I listened to Renee read through it, and then I was quiet for a moment. "What about Carmen?" I asked. "What about Sandra? What about everyone else?" "This offer addresses only your individual claims," Renee said. "The coalition claims are separate, and Gary knows that. This is an attempt to peel you away from the group, settle with you individually, weaken the coalition, then approach the remaining complainants from a position of reduced exposure." I'd suspected as much. "The non-disparagement clause," I said. "That's the real ask." "That's always the real ask in cases like this," Renee confirmed. "They want your silence more than anything else. A silenced Dana Whitfield means the coalition loses its anchor. You were the first. You documented everything. Your evidence is the foundation the others built on." I looked out my kitchen window at the empty posts where my gate had been. The city had issued an order requiring the Hendersons to return my gate or compensate me at replacement cost. The settlement offer was technically compliant with that order. It was designed to look like justice. It was shaped like justice, but it was missing everything that actually mattered. I want Carmen made whole, $9,000 in foundation repairs, minimum. I want Sandra Moore to receive a formal written acknowledgement of the baseless nature of that CPS complaint, drafted by their attorney and submitted to the relevant agency. I want the HOA to conduct a formal review of every complaint filed by the Hendersons in the last 5 years, and I want every affected neighbor notified of the outcome. Renee was quiet for a second. "That's a significant counter." "I know," I said. "Make it anyway. Dana, they may walk away from the table entirely." I thought about my gate. I thought about my garden. I thought about Sandra's $9,000 and Mr. Patterson's careful, quiet dignity, and then Gwynn's looking at each other across my table with the exhausted recognition of people who had been gaslit into doubting their own instincts. Let them walk. We'll see them in court. I didn't go to the media. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What happened was that Deshawn, 26 years old, natural gift for social media, approximately 40,000 followers on a platform I barely understood, posted about his fence permit experience on a Thursday evening, with a caption that mentioned Callaway Street and the ongoing neighborhood dispute in terms that were factual, personal, and completely his own story to tell. By Friday morning, it had 40,000 views. By Friday afternoon, it had 200,000. By Saturday, it had been picked up by 3 local news accounts, 1 regional lifestyle blogger with a significant following, and a podcast about neighborhood disputes and HOA culture that apparently had an audience of people who felt very strongly about exactly this kind of thing. My phone did not stop. Renee called me at 8 a.m. Saturday to assess the situation. Her tone was measured and careful in the way that told me she was actively deciding how to feel about this development. "This is a double-edged situation," she said. "Public attention creates pressure that can accelerate settlement. It also creates noise that defense attorneys use to argue prejudice and complicate proceedings. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Say nothing publicly," she said. "Nothing. Not a comment, not a like, not a share. Let the story exist without your fingerprints on it." I did exactly that. But the story existed powerfully without me. Deshawn's post had opened a door, and people were walking through it with their own Calloway Street stories, their own Henderson experiences, their own variations on the theme of a neighborhood held hostage by one family's need for control. Someone created a hashtag. I will not repeat it here because Renee still gets tense when it comes up, but it was pointed and accurate, and it spread. By Sunday, a local television news producer had contacted Renee directly, requesting an interview. Renee declined on my behalf, but used the contact to communicate something to Gary Tillman that I thought was tactically brilliant. She mentioned, in passing during a routine case communication, that media interest in the matter was significant and growing, and that a prompt and comprehensive resolution would naturally reduce the public profile of the dispute considerably. Gary Tillman called back within 2 hours. He wanted to schedule a settlement conference. I sat in my living room on that Sunday evening and thought about everything that had brought us to this moment. My gate, my garden, 7 neighbors around my dining room table, Carmen's folder, Sandra's quiet, steady voice, the surveyor's report, the camera footage, Renee's 31 case-winning streak, and Pamela Henderson's smile on a Tuesday morning that she thought was the end of something. It was never the end of something. It was always the beginning. Subscribe and stay with me because the settlement conference was 3 days away, and I was walking in there with everything.
The conference was held in a neutral office in downtown Birmingham on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks to the day after I'd stood on my porch in my robe and stared at the empty space where my gate used to be. I dressed carefully that morning, not to impress anyone, not to perform. I dressed the way I dress when I need to feel like myself completely. Dark blazer, good shoes, the small gold earrings my mother gave me when I closed on my house. I looked in the mirror before I left, and I said to my reflection, quietly, the same thing my grandmother used to say to herself before any moment that required her full strength. "You know who you are." Renee met me in the lobby. She was in her element in a way that was genuinely beautiful to witness. Crisp, precise, unhurried, carrying a leather portfolio that I knew contained documentation that would take Gary Tillman approximately 30 minutes to fully absorb, and another 30 to emotionally process. The Hendersons were already in the conference room when we arrived. Rick was in a suit I suspected he'd bought specifically for this occasion. Pamela sat beside him in a cream blazer with her hands folded on the table and her eyes somewhere in the middle distance. Gary Tillman sat across from Renee, looking like a man who had reviewed our full filing the night before and was still working through the implications. Renee opened with a comprehensive summary of every claim, every piece of evidence, every affected party. She was methodical and unhurried, and she did not soften a single edge. The camera footage, the soil contamination analysis, the lab had confirmed a salt compound consistent with deliberate application, the survey, the inspection reports, the CPS filing trace, which Renee's investigator had connected to an IP address registered to the Henderson household with a specificity that made Gary Tillman close his eyes briefly when she presented it. Rick Henderson's face went through several distinct phases during Renee's presentation. The confident neutrality of a man who expected to manage this, the tightening discomfort of a man realizing the scope was larger than he'd anticipated, and finally, and this was the part I will remember for the rest of my life, the particular stillness of a man who understands fully and completely that he has lost. Pamela reached for Rick's hand under the table. I saw it happen. I wasn't supposed to notice, but I did. And in that small, private gesture between two people whose world was contracting around them, I felt something unexpected move through me.
Not sympathy exactly, not forgiveness, but a kind of human recognition, the understanding that even people who do genuinely terrible things are still, underneath it all, just people. It didn't change anything I was going to do, it changed how I felt while doing it.
The final settlement terms took 4 hours to negotiate, and I am not going to pretend that every minute of those 4 hours was comfortable or clean or emotionally simple. It wasn't. There were moments when Gary Tillman pushed back hard and Renee pushed harder. There were moments when Rick Henderson said things across the table that made me grip my pen and breathe through my nose and remind myself that reacting was losing. But here is what we walked out with. Full replacement of my custom wrought iron gate, not the cost, the actual gate, rebuilt to my original specifications by a contractor of my choosing, with the Hendersons paying all costs directly. Complete remediation of the patio encroachment within 45 days, supervised by Gerald Potts at the Hendersons' expense. Carmen Delgado received $11,000, her $9,000 in documented repair costs, plus $2,000 for the years of basement anxiety and the general principle that destroying someone's foundation deserves more than exact change. Sandra Moore received a formal written statement drafted by Gary Tillman's firm and submitted to the relevant agencies, explicitly acknowledging that the anonymous CPS complaint against her household had been filed without factual basis and expressing regret for the distress caused. The HOA agreed to conduct a formal 5-year review of all complaints filed by the Hendersons and notify every affected resident of the findings. The Nguyen's received compensation for documented HOA interference costs. Mr. Patterson and Tanya Bridges received formal written apologies. There was no non-disparagement clause. Renee had refused it from the beginning and held that refusal through every iteration of negotiation. My client's right to discuss her own experience on her own property is not for sale, she had said in the conference room with a flatness that closed the subject permanently. The Hendersons also agreed to pay a portion of our coalition's legal costs. Not all, but enough to matter. I signed my name at the bottom of the agreement at 2:47 in the afternoon. My hand was steady, my eyes were clear. Renee signed as our attorney. Gary Tillman signed for the Hendersons. Rick Henderson signed his name and did not look up from the paper. Pamela Henderson signed last, and right before she capped her pen, she looked up and across the table directly at me. Her expression was complicated in a way I don't have a single word for. There was defeat in it. There was something that might have been shame, and there was, I think, the faintest trace of something that looked almost like respect. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I gathered my copy of the agreement, thanked Renee, and walked out into the Birmingham afternoon sunshine, feeling the particular lightness of a person who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has finally, completely put it down. My gate was coming back. Everything else was already rebuilt.
I will be honest with you, I did not plan to watch. I had told myself, in the rational, mature, emotionally evolved part of my brain, that I did not need to witness the remediation, that the settlement was the victory, and the physical details of its execution were administrative, that standing on my porch watching workers demolish a third of the Henderson patio was beneath the dignity of everything I'd worked to build through this process. I watched anyway. I was on my porch with my coffee at 8 a.m. when the contractor's truck pulled up, and I stayed on my porch for the better part of 2 hours, and I am making absolutely no apologies for it. The demolition crew was professional and efficient. They marked the surveyed property line, Gerald Potts had provided them the exact coordinates, and they removed precisely the encroaching section of the patio with the clean, methodical competence of people who do this work every day and attach no drama to it. For them, it was Tuesday. For me, it was something considerably more significant. Rick Henderson did not come outside during the demolition. His car was in the driveway, so I knew he was home. The curtains on the front room window moved once, early on, and then were still.
Pamela came out once. She stood on their porch for about 5 minutes watching the workers with an expression I could see even from my distance was composed and controlled and costing her something to maintain. Then she went back inside. Carmen came over and stood beside me on my porch without a word. We drank our coffee together and watched in comfortable silence, like two women who had earned the right to witness this particular Tuesday morning. Mr. Patterson walked past on his morning walk and paused at my porch steps and looked at the work being done and nodded once, a deep, dignified nod, and continued his walk. Tanya Bridges texted me a single emoji that expressed her feelings perfectly. When the workers finished and loaded their equipment and drove away, I walked to the property line and stood at the newly cleared boundary and looked at the clean, precise edge of what had been returned to me. 19 inches of ground that had been silently occupied for 6 years. 19 inches that in practical terms meant almost nothing, and in every other sense meant everything. Gerald Potts had placed small boundary markers along the line. I looked at them and thought about my grandmother, who had never owned an inch of ground in her life. I thought about my mother, same story. I thought about 34-year-old Dana Whitfield signing her name on a mortgage with shaking hands and a heart full of a hope so fierce it was almost painful. I crouched down and touched the ground. This is mine, I thought. All of it, every inch. My gate went up the following week, rebuilt to my original specifications, iron and solid and permanent, anchored deep into concrete that I watched them pour myself. It looked even better than the first one.
It has been 7 months since my gate came back. Callaway Street is different now. Not dramatically, not in ways a stranger would notice driving through. The houses look the same. The lawns are still trimmed. The HOA still sends its quarterly newsletters with their cheerful fonts and their community updates. On the surface, very little has changed. But underneath the surface, everything has. The Hendersons are selling their house. I found out through the neighborhood grapevine 3 weeks ago and confirmed it when the listing appeared online. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, recently updated, price to move. The listing photographs are beautiful and carefully angled and do not show the section of patio that is no longer there. Rick and Pamela Henderson are leaving Callaway Street, and I have spent exactly 0 minutes feeling guilty about the role I played in that outcome. Carmen's basement has been dry through 2 full rainy seasons since the retaining wall was corrected. She calls it her miracle. I call it what it actually is, the natural result of water being allowed to go where it was supposed to go all along, unobstructed by someone else's illegal construction. Sandra Moore's mother celebrated her 83rd birthday last month, and Sandra threw a block party. Half of Callaway Street came. It was the first real block gathering this street had seen in years. The kind of easy, unguarded neighborhood afternoon that should be ordinary, but felt, given everything, extraordinary. Mr. Patterson brought potato salad. The Nguyen kids ran through sprinklers with Tanya Bridges' son. I stood in Carmen's front yard with a paper plate and a cold drink and looked up and down my street and felt something so warm and solid it took me a moment to identify it. It was safety, community, the feeling of a neighborhood that belongs to all the people who live in it equally, not just the ones who've decided it's theirs to control. Bree asked me recently what I learned from all of it. She's 17 and sharp and asks questions that cut straight to the bone the way teenagers do when they haven't yet learned to soften their curiosity. We were in the kitchen, where all our best conversations happen, and she was eating cereal and looking at me with that direct, clear gaze of hers. I thought about it for a real moment before I answered. I learned that bullies count on you being afraid to understand the rules better than they do, I said. They build their whole power on the assumption that you won't look too closely, that you'll see the authority they're performing and mistake it for actual authority. Bree considered this, and when you look closely? When you look closely, I said, you find out the patio is 19 inches over the line. You find out the wall is 13 inches too tall. You find out the thing they built their whole empire on was never as solid as they needed you to believe. She nodded slowly. Then she went back to her cereal. My gate stands at the front of my property, iron and permanent and mine.
Every morning when I leave for work, I touch it, just briefly, just one hand on the cold iron, the way you touch something real to remind yourself it's there. It's there. Everything I built is still standing, and that, after everything, is enough. That is more than enough. That is the whole point. If this story moved you, if you've ever had to fight for something that was already yours, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You are not alone, and you are allowed to fight back.